Welcome back to a new video. Here are some tips and tricks if you're considering buying a bass flute or you're struggling to play the one that you've already bought. Here's why they're not ideal for beginners, but some very useful tips that we can use and embrace to make the playing experience of larger, deeper toned bass flutes much easier. So we're going to kick this off with something that I like to think of when I'm comparing more agile flutes to deeper bass tone flutes. And I think it's helpful to think of things this way. So yes, we're going to get into some of the ways that you can hold the flute that make it easier, some of the ways that you can play the flute to make it easier, some tips, and particularly with breath control. We're going to move on to all of that sort of stuff. But actually, an additional thing to think of is what kind of instrument you are playing, because they are different. Our ears hear lower tones or lower vibrations slower. We don't connect with them or respond to them. Even our hearing doesn't respond to these slower vibrations quite so with so much agility. So it doesn't register with us even. So let's think about guitars for a second. Let us think about electric guitar versus bass guitar. So the bass guitar is much less audible. That's not even right, but I'm going to roll with it. It's much harder to hear because the tone of it is obviously much deeper. But playing a bass guitar is not the same as playing like an electric or an acoustic guitar, where there's a lot of agility, there's a lot of fast movements, there's a lot going on there, intricate, fast work. The guitar has agility and will go in all of these different directions and perform quite miraculously. But if you try to implement that style of playing onto a bass guitar, it's just not going to keep up. It's not going to perform in that way. So if we think of flutes a little bit, at least in that kind of way, it helps us understand how we might play flutes that are lower in tone slightly different. So it's going to be slower. It's going to be more meditative rather than quicker and agile and sprightly, you know. So it's a very different energy. That's the way to think about these two different styles of flutes. So you can get away with the agile playing when you're on high tones and mid tones, but as soon as you start to get around kind of like beyond F sharp into E, then it starts to feel a bit different, and particularly when you're D and then you're lower into like your C's and your B's, B3s and stuff. So definitely worth considering those, just the way that we approach playing these lower flutes, as well as these tips coming up of how to deal with that, how to deal with the other complications or the other challenges that these flutes can bring us. So I've mentioned on some of the previous tutorials how important breath control is and how we can improve things also, not just with the breath, but actually the way that we place our fingers on a flute and such things. These things become more critical the larger the flute that we have. And yes, there's certain things as a flute maker that you can do, perhaps particularly if you know it's going to be a stretch for somebody to reach the finger holes, because all the finger spacings are wider apart on a bass flute. But we can only stretch so far, and you can see that my bottom finger here is naturally at full stretch. This flute isn't full stretch for me, but at full stretch it's coming off the central line. And so ergonomically we can make flutes so that the finger hole is here rather than central. But here's the thing, if you're considering that, is if it's not a stretch for you, then if that hole had been there for me when I don't need it to be, that's actually more difficult for me to kind of pull my finger around to try and play the flute, then it would be on the central line as well. So only go for that kind of arrangement or ergonomics on a flute if you know that that finger spacing is going to be a stretch. Now, as a flute maker, if I'm somebody's asking me for like an F sharp or slightly like a mid-range flute even, but I know they have small hands and it's their first flute, then I might ask for a hand measurement, and I'll just ask for them to spread their 4 fingers across a ruler, and I want this measurement to this measurement to know how big that they can span, and also their hand measurement here as well, so that I know this is wrapping around and how much grip that they've got, how much spread that they've got in their fingers without it being a challenge for them, and then I know whether or not perhaps to move this around there for them as well, but only ever as a last resort. It's also more essential that we get used to using our finger pads, the flabby bit of our finger pads, rather than the tips of our fingers. You know that I've spoken about this before, but it's harder to even, you know, the wider we go with our the span of our fingers, the harder it is to maintain this. So if perhaps you've been playing and getting away with this, but now that you're on a bass flute or a bigger flute, it's going to be harder and harder, and you're going to have to try and change things so that you're definitely using your finger pads that fall nicely, covering what are also slightly larger holes on a larger flute, because it's required for the airflow and for the flute to perform properly on each note. You'll find that the finger holes themselves are not only further apart, but they are actually bigger too. So it's definitely critical that we start to cover these holes here. So that's just some on the ergonomics. Using the pads of your fingers more and more essential. We can go on to piper's grip. If you can't even spread this far, then maybe put your finger on the bottom and then just allow these two to fall where they are. That's another way. It's called piper's grip, of ensuring that you cover the holes more easily. There'll be separate tutorials on that to go deeper into that, and I think I've done that before as well. So that's some ways that we can definitely have more successful coverage of the flute. But what about even holding the flute? Like, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be playing the flute out here, and quite a lot of the time, particularly with small flutes, you'll know that we tend to play out here. It's nice, it's comfortable, it's fairly relaxed when the flute is up to a certain size. But the bigger the flute we go, the more important it is to pull it down to a more comfortable playing position without tilting your head too far. You want to be closer into your body, so you're not trying to play something big and outrageously like out here sort of thing. Your arms will begin, and your shoulders will begin to ache. It will perhaps put a little stress on your neck and stuff as well. So we just bring everything a little bit more relaxed and a bit more comfortable down towards the body, like so. So one more thing that you will discover actually when you're holding a flute, a large flute out here. I mean, you can see the angle of my wrist. Say this is a smaller flute. If this is a smaller flute, my wrist is straight. That's quite straight. There's no strain there. But when I pull it out, it begins to bend. You see that? That puts a strain on your wrist. It's not good long term, and it's not particularly good if you're playing for longer time as well. So it's another thing that you'll notice when things are out here and the wrist is bent like that, rather than being here with a shorter flute. When we begin to straighten things up and bring it back to our body, our wrist will straighten too. So it's another added benefit to that. But the last thing that I want to get onto today for playing larger flutes is probably the most crucial. There's probably one of the most tricky things that people find when they're adjusting to larger flutes, and that's getting the bottom note to sound beautiful. So particularly, I have to say, when tonguing. Now, we'll talk about breath control and we'll talk about tonguing. Let's first talk about tonguing. And We want to change from, I mean, this flute has actually been sent to me because somebody stood on it. It's actually got air leaks in it at the moment, which I'm in the process of fixing and sending back out to them. But it's actually demonstrating perfectly at the moment just how, because there's another thing, if you've got leaks in your flute, it's going to overblow quite easily. It's going to cause all sorts of issues. It's really, really important that we have these things sealed up properly. So tonguing, tonguing. We were on tonguing before I digressed. So rather than perhaps going ta 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 ta, so when we tongue, we are try and do that on the bottom notes of a bass flute or one that's got cracks in it. If you're getting that kind of noise, it's because you're tonguing too hard. So we can play the flute without tonguing. But that quick t t t t that's going to force the flute too much air too quickly, and it's going to overblow. So here's how it would work on, I think this is an F sharp or something that I'm halfway through making. The flute can deal with it, can't it? But if I'm playing this like it was a bass flute, we have to make things much, much softer. Now you can choose like a na 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 or a da 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 rather than a ta ta ta. And those sounds, those enunciations, if you like, the D or the N, they're much, much softer. So instead of playing, we're playing So let's try that on this bassier flute. As soon as we start to tongue aggressively, we're slowing things down, we're creating a softer enunciation with either a D or an N or whatever is coming through you. That is the main thing, aside from breath control as well. So even if we're not tonguing, if we start to put a lot of breath on the lower notes as we can with an F sharp, breath control to get, let's go back to this F sharp actually, because it's still important that we don't do that same breath delivery on every single note. If you want to get the best out of your flute, then on the higher notes, the sweet spot is with more breath than on the bottom notes. If I'm forcing it, yes, the flute can handle it, but it's still not at optimal sound quality. It's still beyond the sweet spot of each note. Each note has a different sweet spot, a different delivery of breath, really. It's not that higher pitched flutes are immune to that. It's that they will deal with too much breath or too little breath on their irrespective or their respective holes. But just because they can handle it doesn't mean that the flute is performing at the best of its capability. It's up to us to learn that breath control no matter what flute that we're on. It just becomes more critical on the bigger, the bassier flutes. So you can practice this on any flute that you have in anticipation of even perhaps purchasing a deeper, bassier flute. So we don't want to be delivering you can use it, you can still use it creatively, but back off. That's the sweet spot. Yes, we can force it, we can get away with it, but it's still not the best, it's still not optimal. So when we're going on to the bassy flutes, everything is more critical. The breath control, the tonguing, it's all just more critical. There's a subtlety to that, but we're definitely exploring the sweet spot, the higher, the little bit more air at the top end. Play around with it. Play around with it on each hole of each flute and just back off and increase the breath, the velocity of the breath. Remember the steamy windows versus blowing out the candles. So in terms of the shape of your mouth, there's another thing with breath control. When you're down the bottom end of the flute, you should have a more relaxed jaw. You're breathing air through the flute more in the way that you might deliver steaming up a window. When you want more velocity and you're at the top and you want more air pressure, you're more tense around the lips, the jaw comes up a little bit, everything's a little bit more pursed, and it's more like blowing out a candle with an increased. So I did it on the wrong one, that was all holes closed. Again, just watch the jaw come down, particularly for the last note. It's a good way of delivering a softer breath. So thank you, that is all for today. Hopefully that helps you. I know that these videos have become a little bit more sporadic. I mean, I think it's 3 or 4 weeks since the last one, but I'm still here, I'm still adding content. Hopefully it's useful content for you guys. Let me know in the comments if you found that useful today. Like, subscribe, thank you very much. This is just a growing library, quite genuinely, for people that have either purchased my flutes or flutes from anywhere really, just to help us all improve in our flute playing journeys together. Always appreciate any comments, particularly if they're ideas for things for me to cover on a new video. Thank you so much. Lots of love to everybody. Enjoy playing your flute, and I'll see you on the next video.